everyone, my name's Kelvin and welcome back to another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. Today we're going to paint this kind of semi-realistic cactus illustration. And this is a pretty simple project. I think anybody can do this. The shading can get a little bit tedious, but hopefully in this video I can explain kind of my workflow and how I think about this kind of shading. So I'm going to start out with a blank watercolor paper texture. In this case, I'm going to use the St. Petersburg texture, but you can use any of the paper textures. And as for the brushes, I'm just going to use the regular brush kit. And also, I want to give you guys a free brush kit, and I'll put a link to that one, but I'll also explain it later on in the video. So for this one, I don't think a sketch is necessary. I'm just going to start out on a blank layer underneath the paper texture. And I'm going to start out with the abstract round brush, and I'll just choose a medium green color like that, nothing too saturated, and it's okay if it's not exactly the right shade of green, because we can always shift the hue later on. And using that abstract round, I'm just going to rough out this sort of cylinder cactus shape like this, and then I'll just fill it in. There we go. And I did do sort of 2 layers of brush strokes, so they did start getting darker. But I'll blend that later on. Now at the top of the cactus, it has this kind of lobe shape, so I'm going to use the eraser, and I'm going to set the eraser to the fine liner pen. And at a maybe a small size actually, I'm just going to go in there and sort of define that lobe shape like that, and then just erase it. After that, I'm going to go and grab the water blender brush, and I'm just going to mix up some of these hard edges. After that, I'm going to grab the eraser brush again. And the edge of this is a little bit too smooth, so in just a few areas, I'm going to try to rough it up a little bit, just like that, just to make the edge kind of rougher. And I'm going to do that in a few random areas. Next, I'm going to try to define the shape of the cactus here, the pattern on it. And that's pretty simple. I'm just going to grab the selection tool set to freehand, and I'm going to zoom out here, and I'm just going to start about at this point and just draw a sort of wiggling line. But when I get to the top, I'm going to curve in to that sort of lobe there, curve out again, and then back down, just like that. So it's a little bit hard to see probably, but let me change the brightness so you can see it better. So I just went to hue, saturation, and brightness, and now I can kind of darken that selection, and you'll see that's basically what I drew with the selection tool. Just the main thing is that it curves around and comes to the point of that lobe, and then curves around and goes back down the other side. And just to set it off so I can see it, I think actually I'll lighten it just a tiny bit. So for the shading, basically it's going to be light on the edges, dark, light, light, dark, and light. So what I'm going to do is grab the freehand selection tool again, and I'm going to carefully go along first these edges, these ones that I just drew, but I'm going to do it one side at a time. So then I'm going to go back down like this, just much more randomly, and I'm going to go to hue, saturation, and brightness and darken that. So that's the beginning of the shadow, and I'm going to do another shadow pretty much the same way over here. And all that really matters is that you follow the inside perfectly. What happens out here, you can get kind of creative, and we'll use the water blender on that later to sort of soften it up. Now the final shadow is just down the middle. So I'm going to grab the freehand selection tool again and just draw a selection down the middle and then back up again. Just a pretty skinny, irregular selection. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness and darken that one too. There we go. And now I'm going to do the highlights. So the highlights are on the other sides of these kind of veins, I guess, in the cactus. So there's going to be a highlight here, 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 and here. So I'm going to grab the selection tool again, set to freehand, and I'm just going to select along this side like that. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just brighten that one a little bit. I'll do the same thing to this one. So I've got my highlights and my shadows all figured out. Really the only critical things are, that selection we made earlier where we just lightened the inside. It's this one here. That's the only edge we need to remain sharp. So what I'm going to do is grab the water blender next, and I'm going to blend everything that is not on those edges. So I think it'll make sense if you see it. So I'm just blending down here like this, And I'm being careful not to blend that edge. And then over here with the highlight, I'm going to blend that one as well. I'm going to do the same thing in here. Just soften up that highlight. And then the shadow on the center, I'm basically just going to tap it and just sort of push it from side to side. This doesn't need to be super well defined. And then I'll do the same thing over here. Just soften up that shadow. Go back and soften up the highlight. And all I've just sort of been careful with is just not to blur these lines. So we've got the basics of the shadows of the cactus all figured out. Now what I want to do here is, it looks very flat. Basically one side is a mirror of the other side. And usually on a three-dimensional object, you'd have a difference of like brightness because maybe the light source is on one side or the other. So I'm just going to do a really simple trick with the freehand tool. And I'm just going to select one side and then down the middle. And then that whole side, I'm just going to darken it. And it's okay if it ends up looking too dark after that, because you can always just go and adjust the hue, saturation, and brightness of the whole layer and brighten it back up again. And we still retain that sort of dark side and light side. And just from looking at this, I think I also want to increase the saturation a little bit. And next I'm going to do all the line details. So for that, I'm going to make a new layer above this cactus. And I'm going to choose a pretty dark color. And this is going to be a two-step outline. And I've covered it in a previous video, but I'm going to cover it again here. So in the brush panel, I'm going to use the fine liner pen at a pretty small size actually. And I'm just going to zoom in. And on this different layer above the cactus, I'm going to do just some occasional outlines like this. And basically I'm starting very lightly and pressing harder and then tapering it off. And I'm just going to do this in a handful of areas on all the edges that are important. So these edges, the outside edges, and then very lightly on the inside edge. So there we go. This is the first part of the two-part outline. So I'm going to go to the layer that has those outlines. I'm going to set it to multiply, and I'm going to lower the opacity and just make it so it's just barely visible. There we go. I think that's good enough. I can just barely see it on the edges there. And now for the second part, I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to do more outlines like this, but much less of them, and they're going to be darker. So I'm going to grab the fine liner pen again, and in just a few different areas, I'll do some harder edges, but I'm going to do way less of them. Maybe just 5 or 6 on this whole cactus. There we go. So you can see I've just added a few of those. And I'll go to the layers panel and set this one to multiply just like I did before. But I'll leave the opacity pretty high, maybe around 80%. I think that looks pretty good. Now after this, I can just merge all the outlines and the cactus all onto one layer just like that, just to keep everything organized, and then I'll make a new layer above it. Now on this layer, I'm going to grab pure white, and I'm going to use the fine liner pen again, but at a little bit of a larger size than I used to make the outlines. And just at regular intervals, I'm going to do like a little white dot. So for example, I'll do one here, and then maybe just kind of a regular distance away, I'll do another one here, another one down here, and just so on. And I'm going to do that to this one and this one. And I'm just going to add maybe 1 or 2 on the outside. So there we go. That's a good spacing for those white dots. And I've just added a few along the edge there. And for the spines of the cactus, I'm going to make a new layer above those white dots. And I'm going to choose black. And you can do the spines with the fine liner pen. That works totally fine. But I want to give you this free brush kit that I really love to use. And it's called the Scratchy Pen Brush Kit. It just has these 5 brushes. And you can download it in the description below. And for these spines, I'm going to use the Scratchy liner with this dark color, almost black, maybe something like that's good. And this Scratchy pen, you can see it's kind of has some random appearance, but the point is at the end of the stroke comes to a pretty sharp point, and that's useful when drawing spines on a cactus. And then this kind of random, rough, kind of dry look to it does add some character to this kind of illustration. So for the first layers of spines, I'm going to do the outer ones. So actually, the spines are going to be sort of on the other side of this. So what I'm going to do first is just do some random spines like that just at regular intervals. And after that, I'm going to go in with the eraser and just erase them so it looks like they're sort of on the other side of the cactus, if that makes any sense. And I'm just going to go down and erase all of these and then do the same thing to the other side. There we go. So those are the spines that are sort of on the other side, and we're just seeing the end of them. Now on the same layer, I'm going to do the spines sort of on the front side of the cactus here. So using the same brush, same color, I'm just going to do these real quick. So I know it looks pretty easy when I do these spines, but actually I had to practice a lot because originally my spines were looking pretty much all just like that. But just practice getting random and making sort of different shapes, and it will look much more realistic. So this cactus is almost done. For the spines, I think I'm going to set the layer to multiply for those. I guess I feel like this black spines, they look a little bit too dark. So I think I'll lower the opacity, maybe like 80%. I think that looks pretty good. And now I'm going to do some random variation on the cactus. So I'm going to go and select that layer, this one here. And I'm going to use the freehand selection tool. And I'm going to add a couple of really hard shadows. So I'm going to do that by just sort of going up random areas like this, and sort of following that edge back down. I won't feather it at all. I'm just going to go straight to hue, saturation, and brightness, and just slightly darken that. Now you can see it really brings out that edge. And I'm going to do it again on this side. There we go. And I'm going to do the same thing on the highlights as well. So in just a few areas, I'm just going to go with the freehand selection tool. Just try to follow a random edge, and then just sort of follow it back down. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll brighten it. And it's just a subtle thing. It does add a kind of a nice texture. And I'm going to go ahead and do this in a few other areas. There we go. That looks pretty good. And as a final touch, I'm going to add some color variation using my usual trick, where I just make a sort of random freehand selection like that. And then I'll feather it out quite a bit. I'll go to my hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll shift the hue a little bit just to introduce kind of a different tone. But I think I'm also going to sort of darken it just a little bit and then saturate it. And next, I'm going to add a little bit of lighting, a little bit of glow to this. And I'm going to do that with the freehand selection tool again. But I'm going to make a selection that pretty much goes around the cactus. And then in a few random areas, I'll just sort of follow it back like that. And then I'll feather it out. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness. And this time I'm going to brighten those. I'm going to saturate them and shift the hue a little bit towards yellow. I want to give the impression that this cactus is almost a little bit translucent. And maybe as a final touch here, I'm going to make a kind of a hard color shift. So I'm going to grab my freehand selection tool, and I'm just going to carefully select basically one of these kind of veins of the cactus. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll shift that way towards blue. And because it has a kind of a hard edge, the transition is just like sudden, and it does make it look more like this was painted at a separate time than this. And I'm going to go ahead and do that on another one of these veins as well. There we go. So by not feathering it, it's going to have a hard edge. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and again maybe shift this to something like blue, but I think I'll darken it a little bit, saturate it, just so it has some variation there. And I know the shading on this is a little bit complicated, but I think if you just follow this video step by step and get a little bit of practice in there, it'll be much easier. So that pretty much wraps it up. Let me know if you have any questions or comments about this. You can just leave a comment down below and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. And other than that, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.